Mm. The night I came home from my shift at Walmart, I stood in the hallway for a long moment before I even took off my shoes. It was past midnight. My back ached the way it always did after 8 hours of lifting and bending and walking those cold concrete floors. My hands were dry and cracked from the cardboard boxes. I could hear the television in the living room, loud, the way my son-in-law always kept it, and underneath that, the sound of my daughter laughing at something on her phone. I had been on my feet since 4 in the afternoon. I was 67 years old. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door and walked quietly to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The sink was full of dishes from dinner. Not from my dinner. I hadn't eaten yet. From theirs. There were 2 pots on the stove with dried food stuck to the bottom, a cutting board left out with onion skins still on it, and an empty pizza box sitting on top of the recycling bin instead of inside it. I stood there and drank my water and looked at all of it. Then I turned off the kitchen light and went to my room. My room. Except it wasn't really my room anymore. It was the small one at the back of the house, the one I'd moved myself into 14 months ago when my daughter asked if she and her husband and their 2 kids could stay with me just for a little while. My actual bedroom. The one my late husband Raymond and I had shared for 31 years, the one with the big windows that faced the backyard, that was theirs now. I lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. I had bought this house in 1989. I had painted every room in it. I knew which floorboards creaked and which faucet needed an extra turn to stop dripping. This house was mine in a way that went deeper than any deed. But somewhere in the past 14 months, it had stopped feeling that way. My daughter's name is Renee. She is my only child, and I have loved her with a force that has sometimes frightened me with its size. When she was small, she used to fall asleep in my lap while I read to her, and I would sit there long after she was gone, not wanting to move and break the spell. I still loved her that same way. That was the problem. When she called me 2 winters ago, she was crying. She and her husband Derek had fallen behind on rent. Derek had been laid off, she said. The apartment was too expensive. They needed somewhere to go, just until Derek found work again, just for a few months, and she didn't know who else to call. I said yes before she even finished asking. My friend Beverly told me later that I should have set rules from the very beginning, written them down, a timeline, a contribution to bills, and understanding about shared responsibilities. Beverly is practical in ways I have never quite managed to be. I told her she was probably right, but Renee was my daughter, and I thought love was enough of the framework. I was wrong about that. The first few weeks were fine. Derek was polite in that stiff, effortful way of someone who knows he's asking a favor. The grandchildren. Cody, who was 9, and little Ava, who had just turned 6, were excited about Grandma's house, about the backyard, about sleeping in what they called the big room. Renee cooked dinner twice that first week and left flowers on the kitchen table. I thought, this will work. We will get through this together. By the second month, Derek had stopped looking for work with any urgency. He spent his days watching sports and playing games on his phone. When I mentioned, gently, that I'd seen a job posting at the hardware store in town, he said it was below his skill level. I nodded and said nothing. By the 3rd month, Renee had rearranged my living room furniture without asking. She said it flowed better this way. My grandmother's chair, the wingback one with the rose-printed upholstery that I had reupholstered myself 20 years ago, ended up in the corner facing the wall, because it didn't go with the sectional they brought from their apartment. I moved it back the next day. She moved it again the day after that. I left it in the corner after that. It wasn't worth the argument, or so I told myself. The money situation came to a head in the spring. Derek still wasn't working, or so I told myself. The money situation came to a head in the spring. Renee had picked up some part-time shifts at a hair salon, but what she brought in went toward her car payment and the kids' school expenses. They weren't contributing anything to the household. Not groceries, not utilities, not the mortgage that I was still paying at 66 years old on a fixed income and a part-time bookkeeping job that paid me barely enough to cover it. The electric bill that April was $340. I sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. That was when I started looking at the job listings myself. I found the Walmart overnight stocking position on a Thursday. The hours were 10 at night until 6 in the morning, 4 nights a week. The pay wasn't much, but it was regular, and the overnight differential added a little extra. I applied online and was hired within the week. I didn't tell Renee right away. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was ashamed. Maybe I just didn't want to have the conversation that would follow. The one where she would say I didn't need to do that, and I would have to decide whether to tell her the truth about how close things were getting. She found out when she came downstairs one night at 11 and I was putting on my work vest. She looked at me for a long moment. "Mom, you got a job?" "Just a few nights a week," I said. "At Walmart?" "The overnight shift. It works around my schedule." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You should have told me. We could have figured something out." I looked at her standing there in her pajamas in my kitchen, in my house, while her husband slept in my bedroom, and I said, "It's fine, Renee, go back to bed." She did. I want to be honest about something, because I have thought about it a great deal since then, and I know it is the question people always ask. Why did I let it go on so long? I have asked myself the same thing in the dark. At 2 in the morning, standing in the Walmart stockroom with a pallet of cereal boxes in my back screaming at me. The answer is complicated and also very simple. She was my daughter. Every time I thought about having the hard conversation, about timelines, about money, about what was fair, I would see her at 8 years old, or at 16, or at 23 calling me from a parking lot because she'd had her heart broken. And something in me would say, "Not yet. Give it a little more time. She'll figure it out. She always does." I kept moving the line of what I could tolerate. A little more, and then a little more, and then a little more, and then a little more after that. That is how 14 months passed. There was a woman at Walmart named Gloria who worked the same shift I did. She was 54, broad-shouldered and efficient, with a laugh that filled the whole stockroom. She had been there 11 years. She knew where every product in the store was supposed to go without looking at a label. Gloria and I fell into the habit of taking our breaks together at 2 in the morning, sitting on overturned milk crates near the loading dock and drinking bad coffee from the break room machine. She never asked too many questions, but she listened well. And one night, I found myself telling her everything. She didn't say anything for a while after I finished. Then she said, "So your daughter and her family have been living in your house for over a year, not paying rent, and you got a second job to cover their costs, and you moved out of your own bedroom." When she put it like that, I started. "I'm putting it like that because that's what it is." Gloria said, "You hear me, Dorothy. That is what it is." Her voice wasn't unkind, it was just clear, and sometimes clarity is the thing you've been avoiding, because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. I drove home that morning as the sun came up and thought about what she'd said the whole way. The moment I remember most clearly happened on a Saturday in October. I had worked Thursday and Friday nights, so I had slept most of Saturday morning and come downstairs around noon, still tired, still in the cotton soreness that the overnight shifts left in my bones. I wanted coffee and quiet. The house was loud. Cody had friends over, and they were running through the living room, and the television was on at full volume, and Derek was on the phone talking to someone about a business idea he'd had, pacing through the kitchen where I was trying to make my coffee. Renee was at the salon. I poured my coffee and sat down at the table. One of Cody's friends knocked over a cup of juice on the counter, reaching for something. And nobody moved to clean it up. It dripped onto the floor slowly while the boys ran back out of the room. Derek glanced at it, still on the phone, and then looked at me. Just looked at me. And then he went back to his conversation. I sat there with my coffee and I looked at the juice dripping on the floor, and I thought about Thursday night shift when I had pulled a muscle in my shoulder lifting a case of water. I thought about the electric bill. I thought about my grandmother's chair in the corner facing the wall. I got up and cleaned the juice off the floor. But something had shifted in me while I did it. Something had gone quiet and solid, the way water does when it finally freezes. I called my friend Beverly that afternoon from my car in the driveway. I told her what had happened. Not just that morning. Everything. The whole 14 months. By the time I finished, my voice was steady in a way that surprised me. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy, I love you." And I need you to hear this. You have been disappearing inside your own house. You know that, right? I said I was starting to. You need to talk to someone, she said. Not me. Someone who can tell you what your actual options are. She meant a lawyer. I knew she meant a lawyer, and some part of me recoiled from the word because this was my daughter, not a stranger. But I wrote down the name of the attorney Beverly recommended, and I sat with it in my purse for 3 days, and then I called. The lawyer's name was Patricia Chen. She had short gray hair and a direct manner and an office that smelled like old books and coffee. I sat across from her and told her the situation. She asked several practical questions. She did not look surprised by any of it. When I was done, she said, "You are the sole owner of the property." "Yes." "There is no lease agreement in place?" "No." "Written arrangement of any kind?" "No, nothing written." She nodded. "Then legally, your daughter and her family are guests. You have the right to ask them to leave. If they don't leave voluntarily, there is a formal process, a notice to vacate, and if necessary, an unlawful detainer action. But most of the time, once people receive the formal notice, they understand it's serious." I looked at my hands in my lap. She is my daughter. Patricia Chen looked at me with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite impatience, but somewhere between the two. She said, "I understand, but I want you to think about something. Right now, you are working the overnight shift at 67 years old to pay for a household that 4 other adults and children are benefiting from, and you have moved out of your own bedroom. What are you protecting her from exactly?" I didn't have an answer. I took the paperwork home with me. I spent a week thinking about it. I went to work on Tuesday and Thursday night. I cleaned the kitchen twice. I watched Derek spend an entire Sunday on the couch. I watched Renee come home from the salon and immediately start scrolling her phone. Nobody asked how my shoulder was, the one I'd pulled at work. On Friday morning, after my shift, I came home and stood in the hallway again in the same way I had stood there so many times before. The house was quiet. Everyone was asleep. I walked through the living room, past my grandmother's chair in the corner, into the kitchen, out the back door and into the yard, where the garden had mostly gone to seed because I hadn't had the time or the energy to tend it this fall. Raymond's rose bushes were there along the fence, leggy and unpruned, but still alive. I stood there in the early morning cold in my work vest and I thought about Raymond, who had died 7 years ago and who had worked his whole life to pay for this house, who had sat in that garden on summer evenings and been content, who had loved this place the way you love something you built with your own hands. I thought, what would he say if he saw this? I went back inside and I called Patricia Chen. I did not serve the papers myself. Patricia's office handled the formal notice, a 30-day notice to vacate. It was delivered on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my bookkeeping job. When I came home that evening, Renee was sitting at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her. Her face was a kind of pale I had not seen since she was a child and genuinely frightened. "Mom," she said. I sat down across from her. "What is this?" she said, though I think she knew exactly what it was. "It's a notice," I said. "It means that I need you, Derek, and the children to find another place to live. You have 30 days. She stared at me. "You're evicting us. I'm asking you to leave. The notice is the formal version of that. We have nowhere to go," I said gently. "Renee, you have had 14 months to prepare for this. I understand it feels sudden, but it isn't sudden. You have known this couldn't last forever." Her voice rose. "You didn't say anything. You never said anything was wrong." And that landed somewhere true and uncomfortable. She was right that I hadn't said it clearly enough. I had hinted and sighed and moved quietly around my own house like a guest. But I had not sat her down and said, "This is unsustainable and I need it to change." That was on me. "You're right that I should have said it more clearly sooner," I told her. "I'm saying it clearly now." She cried. I sat there and I let her, and I didn't take it back. Derek came downstairs at some point and started talking about rights and fairness and what about the kids, and I listened to all of it and said, when he was finished, "I understand you're upset. The timeline is in the paperwork." He stared at me like he didn't recognize me. Good, I thought. That means I finally started being someone real. The next 4 weeks were uncomfortable. I won't pretend otherwise. There were arguments, and there were days of pointed silence, and there was one evening when Renee came to my room and sat on the edge of the bed and cried in a way that made my chest ache. I held her hand. I did not change my mind. What helped was that I kept going to work. I kept coming home in the morning and standing in my hallway and knowing that in a finite number of days this would be my house again. That knowledge made everything bearable in a way it hadn't been before. They found an apartment. It took 3 weeks, and there was some help from Derek's brother with the deposit. And it was smaller than they wanted and in a neighborhood that Renee said was not ideal. But it was theirs to manage. Their name on the lease. Their bills to figure out. On the day they moved out, I helped carry boxes. Not because I had to, but because she was still my daughter, and I was still her mother, and I wanted her to know that those two things were not canceled by what had happened. When the last box was gone, I walked through the empty rooms. My grandmother's chair was still in the corner facing the wall. I turned it around. I opened the windows in my bedroom and let the cold November air move through the space. I stood in the middle of the room and breathed. I cannot tell you what that felt like exactly. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief, quite. It was something older and quieter, like remembering who I was. I still work at Walmart a couple nights a week. Not because I have to anymore, but because Gloria is there, and because I have to anymore. But because Gloria is there, and because I have come to value the rhythm of those early morning hours. The particular silence of a store before it opens, the fast fact it sits bet. Gloria asked me, a few weeks after the move out, how I was doing. I said, better than I've been in a long time. She handed me my coffee and said, I know. I could tell the minute you walked in tonight. You're standing different. I thought about that on the drive home, about what it means to stand differently. About how long I had been making myself small in my own house, in my own life, without quite realizing I was doing it. Raymond's roses needed pruning. The garden needed attention. There was a list of small repairs I'd been putting off for a year because I never had the time or the quiet to think about them. I bought pruning shears on my lunch break the next day. My daughter and I talk on the phone now, twice a week. It is not the same as before. Not the easy closeness of when she was small, but not the careful distance of those 14 months either. It is something new, something more honest. She has not apologized directly. I don't know if she fully understands, even now, what the cost of those months was. But she calls and she asks how I am, and last week she asked for my pot roast recipe, the way she used to when she first had her own kitchen. I gave it to her. I still love her with that same frightening force. I just understand now that love is not the same thing as surrender, that taking care of someone does not mean disappearing for them. My house is quiet in the evenings. I eat dinner when I want to, what I want to. I leave my book on a kitchen table and nobody moves it. I sit in my grandmother's chair by the window and watch the light change in the backyard, and I think about Raymond and what he built and why it was worth protecting. I think about Beverly telling me I had been disappearing inside my own house, and how right she was, and how long it took me to hear it. I think about Patricia Chen asking what, exactly, I was protecting my daughter from. I think about Gloria on a milk crate in the cold saying, that is what it is. Sometimes you need someone outside the story to hand you the words for what you're living, to say it plainly so you can't look away from it anymore. I am 67 years old. I work the overnight shift. I come home in the mornings and unlock my own front door and walk into a house that is exactly as I left it. I cannot tell you how much that means. I can only tell you that I spent a long time not knowing what I was giving up, and that I know now and that I will not give it up again.